Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and our tutorial series on World in Flames Collector's Edition. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subsystems in the game, and that is the production system. Now, one of the appealing things about grand strategic level gaming is that it puts you in total control of your nation's war effort. Not just in command of the various campaigns in the different theaters, but also the composition of your armed forces. You get to decide how many tanks, how many planes, how many ships that you need to build in order to create the force you need to meet your objectives in the game. And in typical WIF fashion, the production system is fairly detailed. Actually, it's pretty detailed for this level of gaming. But detailed does not necessarily mean complicated. So I think what we'll do is we'll start off with just a real brief high-level overview of how the system works, and then we'll dive in and take a look at various aspects in greater detail. In World in Flames, the production system is represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the resources, which represent raw materials, and the factories, where those raw materials are converted into something useful like tanks and planes. Each turn, you will transport the resources that you control from their location in various hexes on the maps to factories that you control, where they will be converted into production points. You will total the number of production points that you generate this turn, and then multiply that by your nation's production multiple. The result is the number of build points that you have to spend on constructing new units or repairing damaged naval ships. That's essentially how the production system works, and we could end the video right here, but I'm not going to. Even though you've got a very simple general overall framework, there are a number of details in the system, and you will find that in any game you will be facing a lot of tough choices to make as to what to construct, when to construct, and how to acquire more resources to feed your ever-growing needs. Now, one of the key aspects of the system is the production multiple. This will vary over time. It generally increases as each year goes by, and we'll take a closer look at this later in this episode. But the higher your production multiple, the more bang for your buck, literally, that you're going to get out of the production points. So early in the game, resources, the number of resources and factories that you have are not going to be as efficient at churning out the guns that you need to achieve your objectives. By late war, however, everyone's economy has shifted more into the wartime footing, and you are going to be getting more build points per production point that you're able to generate. So let's take a look at the system in a little more detail. And we're going to start off with the very first step in that, and that is how you get the resources from where they're located to your factories. Let's look at resource transportation. Now, you've probably noticed that there are a couple of different types of resources on the map. We have these orange circles with the pick and shovel. These represent general resources. The oil derrick here represents oil resources. Now, unless you are using any of the oil options, these resources are treated exactly the same, except for strategic bombardment. So these are completely interchangeable, and there is no difference as far as production is concerned. Also, you can see we have some factories here. There's in Hanover, we have what is a single stack factory, whereas over here in Dortmund, we have two factory stacks. Each stack represents a factory. Each factory can accommodate one resource. So for Hanover factory, we have a resource in the same hex. This resource is basically automatically transported to this factory. Here in Dortmund, we have a resource in the hex, which one of the factories can use, and we could also transport this oil resource to the second factory in that hex. What you're going to do is you're going to keep track of the number of factories you control, and that's the number of factory stacks that you see. Berlin here has 3 stacks, and that is the highest number of stacks you will see in any single hex. key thing to remember with the system is that one resource per stack, and that is going to then generate a production point for you. You also notice, if we look at Dortmund here again, that one of the stacks is red and one of the stacks is blue. Red stacks are factories that can be used by an enemy major power if they capture the hex. Blue factory stacks cannot be used. So, Dortmund being in Germany, if the Allies enter and capture this hex of Dortmund, they would be able to use one of the two factories for their own production purposes. And you will see there are fewer red factories scattered throughout the maps than there are blue factories, but this is how you are able to increase your production by conquering other countries, either minor countries or enemy major powers. Now, in order to produce that production point, we need to get the resources from their current locations to a factory stack. That must be done along the rail lines here. Now, they do not need to start at a station, which, if you recall from our earlier episodes, is either a city, a port, or a headquarters unit. As long as the rail line goes through the resources hex, it can start there and then follows a path along a rail line to its end destination. A couple of things to keep in mind. The resource can only enter an enemy zone of control if you have a friendly land unit in that hex. And in any event, as soon as it enters the enemy ZOC, it must stop. So if there were an allied unit in the hex here exerting a zone of control into this hex, the oil resource that is German controlled could not be traced into this hex unless there was a German land unit there. And even if there was, it would still have to stop here and it would not be able to reach Hanover or continue on elsewhere. That's really all there is to transporting resources overland. However, as you may guess, there are a number of resources that are located overseas. So how does resource transportation overseas work? Very similarly, but there's a little bit of difference. So let's take a look. Now, before we look at overseas resource transportation, I wanted to clarify the three restrictions on transporting resources by rail or road. First, you may only transport resources through hexes that you control, through hexes that are in neutral minor countries, or hexes controlled by another major power, but only if it allows you. And the Allied major powers, except for the Soviet Union, may only trace resources through Soviet-controlled hexes while the USSR is at war with Germany. Now, let's take a look at how the overseas transportation works. Now, if you cannot rail a resource directly to a friendly controlled factory, you are going to need to rail the resource to a port and then through a C zone or chain of C zones that contain convoy points to another friendly controlled port where you could then continue railing it until it reaches its final destination. As an example, let's look at France here. They control Algeria at the beginning of the game, and in Algeria is located a general resource down here in the south. Now, there are no factories that France controls in Algeria or North Africa, so she's going to have to transport this resource back to a factory she controls in metropolitan France. To do so, she's going to need to ship the resource to either the port of Oran or Algiers, or any other controlled port. It could be Bonn over here or Tunis. Upon reaching the port, it would then enter the Western Mediterranean Sea Zone where they have 5 convoy points located, and then would debark, if you will, in any of the ports that are friendly controlled bordering this sea zone. In this case, the choice would be Nice, Toulon, or Marseille. As you can see, we do have a factory in Marseille. And that is how the resource is going to get overseas. Now, while you can rail, then ship, and then rail, you cannot rail, ship, rail, and then ship again. So you only get to use convoy points at one point in the trace from the resource back to the factory. Also, you cannot trace more, you cannot transport more resources through a C zone than you have number of convoy points located in that C zone. Now, allied major powers that are currently at war can transport one another's resources. So if, for example, the Commonwealth were lending some resources to France, and those resources were coming from over here in the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as, say, India or South Africa, and they were transporting through the Western Med here, if there were 7 or 8 total resources that were being shipped into southern France here, and France only had 5 convoy points, we could also place a Commonwealth convoy point marker there. That would give us the capacity we need to ship all of those resources through the C zone. And it's important to remember that if you are chaining C zones together, that you're going to need the total capacity for that C zone in each of the C zones. Let me show you what I mean by that. In this example, we're looking at Canada, which is part of the Commonwealth. Now, Canada contains a total of 6 resources. There's 1 oil resource and 5 general resources. Canada also contains 2 factories. So 2 of these resources can be railed to these 2 factories, but that leaves 4 resources that are going to go to waste unless they can be transported to another factory that the Commonwealth controls. In the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth has plenty of factories, but only a handful of resources. So we need to transport the 4 resources from Canada to the United Kingdom factories. That's going to require railing those resources to Halifax and then shipping them across the sea from Halifax to the UK. In order to do that, we're going to trace that transportation through the East Coast, then to the North Atlantic, and you can see the North Atlantic connects to the Bay of Biscay on the West European map. And then from the Bay of Biscay, it can enter any number of ports here at Plymouth or Liverpool or any of the minor ports. Now, in order to transport those 4 resources, we are going to have at least 4 convoy points in each of the C zones. So we have 5 convoy points here in the East Coast and in the North Atlantic. And as we come over here to the Bay of Biscay, you'll see we have 10 convoy points. That's because the UK is also receiving resources from further south, from South Africa and around the Horn, from around the Cape, from India. So we have 5 resources coming through Cape St. Vincent. When those 5 resources get into the Bay of Biscay, they are also going to meet up with the 5 resources, or the 4 resources coming out of Canada into the Bay of Biscay. So we have a total, in this case, of 9 resources that are being transported through the Bay of Biscay. Therefore, we're going to need to have a total of 10 convoy points in this C zone in order for all of those resources to make it to their final destination at a factory here in the UK. Now, in the basic World in Flames game, without the Ships in Flames option, convoy points come in 2 sizes, either 5 or 10. If you use the Ship in Flames option, which I highly recommend for a number of reasons, one of which is the fact that these convoy points come in denominations anywhere from 1 to 10. So rather than having 5 convoy points here and a 5 convoy point marker there, if I'm only shipping 4 convoy points through these 2 zones, I can have 4 convoy points located in each of them rather than 5. And they work just like change, and it allows you to more efficiently distribute your convoy pipelines. Now, one thing with transporting resources overseas is there may be a time where a major power is at war with one particular enemy major power, but not another one, and that other major power is transporting resources on their convoy point rather than the country that you are at war with. For example, let's say Germany and the Commonwealth are at war, and the United States is lending resources to the UK here, and they are able to ship them on American convoy points rather than Commonwealth convoy points. In this case, Germany may do what is called a search and seizure action. In order to do this, she's going to have some kind of surface combat ship or aircraft carrier in the sea zone with the neutral convoy points. There can be no neutral ships that are surface combat ships or carriers in that sea zone. Germany would simply say we are conducting a search and seizure, and any of the resources that are being transported through that sea zone would then be lost to the Commonwealth. The cost of doing this, however, is that it is a U.S. entry action. This will trigger a roll on the U.S. entry table under the U.S. entry actions, as we see here. Search and seizure is, let's see, where is search and seizure here? There are two. There's one if Japan conducts a search and seizure. You can see right here, number 34. It is a 2. So every time Japan conducts a search and seizure, the American player would roll one 10-sided die. If they roll a 1 or a 2, then the U.S. would get to draw an entry chit and put it into the Japanese entry pool. So there is a cost to search and seizure, but that is one way that you can interrupt the transportation of resources from a neutral power to another power that you are currently at war with. Having gotten our resources to our factories, we are then ready to proceed with the next step in the production process. But before we get to that, I wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, there is a very handy chart on the play aids that lists the location and quantities of all of the factories and resources on all of the maps, and it's listed by country. So the first column here is the number of factories, and you'll see two numbers. The number to the left of the slash is the number of blue factories, and the number to the right is the number of red factories. Now remember, red factories are important because red factories can be captured and used by an enemy major power in their production. Blue factories are simply lost to the owner until they are recaptured. The next column is the resources column, and again we have two numbers separated by a slash. The number to the left of the resource, or to the left of the slash, is the number of general resources located in that country, and the number to the right of the slash are the number of oil resources that are located in that country. And again, oil and general resources, unless you're using any of the oil options, they are treated exactly the same. And you can see down here that the chart also gives you the grand total. So there are 129 blue factories and 66 red factories. It gives us a grand total of, I believe it's 195 total factories on the maps that can be used. And then resources, we have 138 general resources and 56 oil. So that's going to bring us up to 194 total resources. Now, there are some options that will allow for the building of additional resources like synthetic oil plants and so forth. But you can see without those options, you're looking at 195 factories and 194 resources total in the game. The production portion of WIF is one of the aspects that requires some record keeping, and I just want to give you a quick glance at generally how I do that record keeping. There are a couple of pieces involved. First, you're going to have to keep a build record of what you actually build, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but you are going to have to keep records of the number of factories and resources that you control. So I'll usually take a large 5x8 index card or something similar sized, and I will break this down into various areas. You can see for Germany here, I've got the PM. This is production multiple. I always list the current production multiple up top here, and then I will keep track of the number of factories that Germany controls. In this case, Germany controls 25, and then I will list where those factories are located. So you can see we have 19 in Germany itself, 1 in Austria, 3 in Czechoslovakia, 1 in Poland, and 1 in Belgium that she controls for a total of 25. Below that is the resources section, and I'll keep track of general resources and oil resources separately, especially if I am playing with oil, any of the oil options. And then again, I just simply keep track of where those resources are. So you can see there's 1 oil in Germany, 1 oil in Austria, 8 general resources in Germany, 2 oil in Romania, and so forth. Next, I'm going to keep track of the number of resources that I lend to other powers and to whom. So in this case, we are lending 2, not resources, but build points to the USSR. We are receiving from other countries 3 from Sweden, 1 from Turkey, 5 from the USSR, and 2 oil from the USSR, for a total of 11 total received, breaking down as to 9 general and 2 oil. Finally, up top here, I keep track of the number of production points. So we've got 25 factories. We have a total of 18 resources, 18 plus another 11 for 29. Of those 29, we can only really use 25 of them for production. That's going to give us 25 production points. We multiply 25 by 0.75 and then round, which is going to give us our total number of build points. These are the build points that we will then use for production this turn. And when we produce our units, we will keep track of how many units we produce of what class unit as we go turn by turn. And we'll look at that a little bit here in a few minutes. You've heard me mention production multiple a few times, and you're probably wondering, well, how do I know what my country's production multiple is? Located on the play aids, immediately above the resources and factories chart is your production multiples chart. As you can see, it lists each of the major powers down the left-hand side here, and across the top are the years of the game. And you simply cross-reference whichever major power you control with whichever year it is, and that's going to give you your production multiple. And you can see these range anywhere from a low of 0.25 for the USA all the way up to a high of 1.5 here later in the war. So for instance, Germany in 1939 has a production multiple of 0.75, and that is what we saw here on the example card. What that means is 25 times 0.75 is going to give you 17. Now, if instead of being 1939 or 1940, instead it were 1944, this production multiple would be 1.5, which means we would multiply 25 by 1.5, which is going to give us a total of 37.5, which rounds to 38. So you can see that German production, even if they do not control any additional factories or additional resources and are still producing the same 25 production points, are going to have twice as many, slightly more than twice as many due to rounding, build points that they are able to use to produce new units. Before we leave production multiples, one last thing is to make sure to check the production multiple notes here right below the chart. You can see that you get +1 build point for each of your major power core-sized land units that are destroyed while in supply in its home country. And this applies to any of the home countries for the Commonwealth. So it would be Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, or India. Below that, you'll see that B here applies to the United States, and it gets +0.25 for each of U.S. entry options 22 and 34, when it goes to war and when it goes to total war. So if the U.S. selects both of these options, has gone to war, and has reached total war, that would be a total of +1.0, which, if you look out here, means in 1945, the United States is going to have a production multiple of 1 plus 1 for a total of 2, which is the highest production multiple you will see in the game. And then finally, Note C applies to the USSR, and it basically gives a +0.25 to this chart number from January, February 1942, or the turn that Germany declares war on the USSR, whichever comes first. Now, let's take a look at the rest of the process. We are going to stick with the example of Germany that I showed you just a few minutes ago, and we are going to presume that Germany has transported 25 of her controlled resources to her 25 factories, giving her 25 production points. Her production multiple is currently 0.75, resulting in 17 build points. She has 17 build points now to spend on units that are in her force pools. And if you'll recall back early in the tutorial series when we looked at the units themselves. On the back of each counter are two numbers. There's a green number, or a number in a green circle and a number in a white circle. The number in the green circle is the build point cost to build that particular unit, and the white circle indicates how long it will take to build that unit. So in this case, we have a German armored core that costs 6 build points and takes 4 turns to arrive. So of my 17 build points, I'm going to spend 6 of them to build this armored core. The current turn is July-August 1940. Since this takes 4 turns, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 turns out, and I will place the unit to arrive during the reinforcement phase of the March-April 1941 turn. I will continue spending my build points. I'm going to spend 3 more build points to build an infantry corps. Cost 3. This only takes 2 turns to arrive, so it's going to be placed here in November-December 1940. Finally, I'm going to continue to increase the size of the Luftwaffe, so I'm going to build 2 pilots. Pilots cost 2 points, 2 build points each, and they take 3 turns to arrive. So the pilot in training marker will go 1, 2, 3 turns out into the future, and they will arrive in January, February 1941. I am also going to spend 3 points to build a German land bomber, attack bomber. Now, as you can see, I'm using the pilot's optional rule here, and in that case, the 5 cost actually includes the cost of the pilots. With the planes in flames option, or the pilot's optional rule, the cost of the pilots is subtracted from the aircraft, since you are able to build pilots separately from airplanes. So rather than costing 5, because we've already paid 2 for a pilot, this is only going to cost 3 build points, and it's going to take 3 turns, which means it's also going to arrive in January, February when the 2 pilots do. Now, I have 1 build point left. I also have a submarine here in the construction pool, and with naval units in the construction pool, you can see this naval unit has 2 build point costs separated by a slash. To the left is the build point cost that you have to pay when it comes out of your force pool and goes on the production circle for its first cycle. At the end of that first cycle, when it is face down, it will then go into the construction pool face up. When you build something out of the construction pool, it's going to go on the circle for a second cycle, and I'm going to pay the cost to the right of the slash. In this case, it's 1 build point, and it's going to be 3 turns. So I will place this 1, 2, 3 turns in the future in January, February, but because it's the second cycle and it's coming out of the construction pool, it's going to be face up. And that's how you know whether a naval unit is going to go on map or if it's going to go into the construction pool. If the unit is face down during the reinforcement phase, it's going to come off and it will go into the construction pool. If it's face up, like these subs are, it's going to go on map. That brings us to a total of 17 build points for the July-August 1940 turn. The rest of the major powers would build, and then we would continue on with the sequence of play. Now, there are build charts that I mentioned earlier, along with the sort of the resource card, that little homemade thing that I use here. Let me take a look at those, and we'll talk about these build charts here briefly. Located in the center of the rule book is a sample build chart that you are free to photocopy and use, and you can see that it tracks much of the same things that I've got on my homemade card, such as resources, factories, build points, including those that are lent and received, as well as the actual units you produce by class. So you have infantry class, cavalry, armor, artillery, supply, you've got offensive chits, aircraft, pilots, V-weapons, ships, subs, and so on. Now, I don't use these pre-made charts primarily because there's not enough room here to really record everything that I'd like. I tend to like to track where the factories and resources are located, not simply how many I have. And I do that, I take a little bit of extra time to note down exactly where they're located, because it makes it easier to track during play when control of the resources are gained or lost. So if the Allies are advancing in Belgium and they capture the resource hex in Belgium, well, I know I can go right here. There's Belgium there, and I can erase that resource and adjust my total controlled, rather than having to go through and scour the entire map and count up all of my resources every single turn to get that total. Now, some of you may be asking, well, why do you care about recording what you actually build? And I'll show you the sheet that I use that I've found online. I think this was on Board Game Geek. Somebody developed this for use with the Days of Decision grand campaign, and it works just fine for plain old World of Flames games. As you can see, it starts a little earlier here in 1936. It has the turns listed by number rather than by month. So 1937 is the January-February turn. The 3 is the May-June turn, and so on. You see it goes all the way down to 1946 here. And it's got some boxes here for offensive chits, armor, infantry, cavalry, guns, pilots, aircraft, all kinds of optional units that are included in the game. And so what you will do is simply record the number of units that you built. So we can look here on this, the example we just had. We built 1 armor unit, we built 1 infantry unit, 2 pilots, 1 aircraft, and 1 submarine. And those are recorded right down here. Now again, why do we care what we built and how much we built of them? And I generally have avoided talking about optional rules in these episodes so far, because I'm saving all the optional rules towards the end, because I'd like people that are not going to use the optional rules to not have to sit through me talking about all of these things and wasting their time. So we're trying to present just the core vanilla basic rules, if you will, in these episodes. And then as we get to the end of this series, I will then go ahead and talk about all of the optional rules at that point. However, there is one that I really want to talk about in this episode, and it's because it's an optional rule that until Collector's Edition was not an optional rule, and I think it was a big mistake turning it into an optional rule, although it's easily rectified by simply deciding to use the optional rule. And that is the gearing limits optional rule. The gearing limits basically restrict you in the number of units you can build of a particular class. So we're talking about armor class, infantry class, and so on. You can only build 1 more of a particular class of unit than you built the previous turn. And this is representative of the difficulty in shifting your industrial production from building something as radically different as airplanes to submarines or ammunition or tanks, whatever it may be. And for me, that gearing limit rule is really one of the hallmark rules that made without the gearing limits, the production is not as interesting, fun, or challenging as it otherwise would be. So I really think it was a mistake to change the gearing limit rule into an optional rule, although I do have a theory as to why they did that. And if my theory is correct, again, I have no inside information. I haven't had a chance to talk to Harry or any of the other folks involved in the Collector's Edition development. But if the reason is what I suspect it is, I think, again, it was a mistake, and they were treating the symptom and not the disease. But we can get into that in another episode. If anybody watching this does have some firsthand information as to why they decided to take the gearing limits rule and remove it from the core game and make it an optional rule, please go ahead and let me know down in the comments, because I really am curious about that. You can see that the gearing limits rule has kind of some big implications in how your production goes. If you are geared up for a land conflict and you are building infantry units and armor units exclusively, and all of a sudden your Air Force takes a lot of losses in a single turn, it's going to take you a while to replace those, because if you had built 0 aircraft the previous turn, you are now going to be limited to building a single air unit. Next turn, you can build 2 units, and then the turn after that, you'd be able to build 3, and so on. So what this gearing limit rule does is it really rewards planning when it comes to production. And that, for me, that's one of the really fun aspects of this game. You've got control of your production, but you've got to sit down and have some kind of a plan of how you're going to win the game. Production takes time, just as it did historically. So you need to be thinking, at least in general terms, a year or maybe even a year and a half ahead of time, to make sure that you have the Army you need and the Air Force you need and the Navy you need on map when you need it. And back in the day, with the earlier editions of this, but my buddies and I, we would sit around and we would spend a lot of time in between our game sessions just working on our build schedules and figuring out, trying to optimize our building plans so that we could optimize our forces on map for what we hoped we would be trying to accomplish at any given point in the future. Now, with Collector's Edition, that gearing limit rule has become optional. You don't have to use it, which means you can build 0 aircraft units on this turn, and next turn you could build 6 or 7 of them. You're limited only by the number of build points you have and your counter mix. And I think, unfortunately, that takes an awful lot away from the game as a whole, and particularly from the production part of the game. Now, what we've seen is pretty much all of the production. It's not terribly detailed or complicated, but there is a lot to it, as maybe you're starting to get a sense of. And perhaps if you're watching some of the playthrough videos that I have of the Grand Campaign, you're seeing a little bit of that occurring over there. There are a couple of other minor little things I want to talk about. The big one of that is Lend Lease. So let's take a look at Lend Lease. In WIF, you can give not only resources to friendly major powers, but also build points. And WIF uses the term Lend Lease to refer to this process. And that's named after the device that President Roosevelt used to circumvent the U.S. neutrality laws before they entered the war. With Lend Lease, it's very simple. You announce how many build points you're giving and to whom during the lending stage at the beginning of the turn, and then during the production step, you will transport the build points the exact same way that you transport resources from the lending nation to the receiving nation. And you will transport them to any city or port in the receiving nation's country. Now, unlike resources, which have to go to actual individual factories, build points represent the finished product. The only thing missing are the troops to man the equipment. So you don't need to send build points to factories, and you can send build points above what you might normally be able to send as far as resources go. You can send an extra 2 build points if you are sending it to the capital, and an extra 1 to each other city and port, and that's cumulative. So the United States could send up to 6 build points here to London. It would have 1 for each of the factory stacks, so that's 3. In addition to that, they'll have 2 for London being the capital, and because there's a port, you would add a 6th build point that can be shipped there. The receiving country simply spends the build points as if they had manufactured them themselves this turn to build their units. Convoy points are used to send the resources, and any convoy points, to send the build points. Any convoy points that are used to transport resources cannot also transport build points. So if you have 5 resources flowing through a C zone and you are sending 5 build points as well, you will need a total of 10 convoy points in that C zone to handle that capacity. Other than that, there are some restrictions involving China and the U.S. Normally, countries need to be at war in order to send and receive build points via Lend Lease. However, the United States has some exceptions if certain U.S. entry options are chosen. So you'll want to check Rule Section 5 and then Rule Section 13.3.2 to check on those restrictions. There's one other aspect of Lend Lease that I'd like to talk about, and that is foreign-sourced aircraft. And whenever you do your yearly force pool additions, whenever you see aircraft with a colored horizontal stripe on them, you do not place those in your force pools. Instead, those aircraft go into the Lend Lease pool. These represent foreign-sourced aircraft that come from a friendly major power. So, as an example here, we have a couple of Italian aircraft with a gray stripe. The color of the stripe indicates the source major power, gray in this case being Germany. Now, before the Italians can place these units into their force pools to build them, they first need to receive the units from the Germans. So the Germans, if they agree, would then go to their force pools. They would remove the unit that matches the foreign-sourced aircraft here exactly. So it's going to be not just the same type of aircraft, but the factors are all going to match up. So you can see we have the German source aircraft here. In this case, it's a Stuka dive bomber with a 3 air-to-air, 2 air-to-sea, 3 strategic, and 6 TAC, and a range of 4. All of those factors match the Italian exactly. The Italian would then be able to take this unit and place it into its force pools to be built either in this turn or future turn. Now, on the back of the source aircraft, you can see the aircraft silhouette is in the color of Italy, kind of that sort of yellowish green color. This is how you know that an aircraft is, in fact, a potential source aircraft to be built by a foreign power. Whenever the Italian aircraft is shot down, it will go back into the Italian force pools, unless the German says, hey, we want the airplanes back, in which case the unit will come back into the Lend Lease pool, and Germans will then be able to take back the source aircraft and put it into their force pool cups to allow it to be built by the Germans in future turns. So that is foreign-sourced aircraft, which fall vaguely under the Lend Lease rules. You can read all about those on page 52 of the rulebook. Well, that's going to do it for our look at the production system in World in Flames. Now, as you can see, it's not a terribly complex system, mechanically speaking. You simply transport your resources via rail or convoy points, or a combination of both, to your factories, where they're turned into production points, and then your production multiple will determine ultimately how many build points you have to spend on building your units. But within that simple framework, there is a lot going on, and you will find that many times, if not most of the time, production is driving the strategies of both sides in the game. The Axis are seeking to acquire as many additional resources and red factories as they can, as quickly as they can, to give them some sort of production advantage, or at least parity with the Allied powers, because eventually the Allied production potential is going to outweigh that of the Axis. The United States in particular is a production powerhouse in this game, as it should be. However, it's going to take several years for the United States to fully realize that potential. So in the meantime, Germany, Japan, and Italy need to go out and grab as much as they can in order to be as prepared and have the biggest militaries on the board as possible to withstand the late game onslaught of the Allies. From the Allied perspective, production is a key consideration for them, particularly when Germany, or if Germany, decides to invade the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will initially lose quite a bit of its productive capacity as the Germans drive eastwards, and it's up to the Western Allies then to consider how many build points and or resources they can spare from their own building efforts to send to the Soviet Union to prop them up and enable them to continue to field the armies that are going to be needed in Russia in order to tie down the Germans, as well as how they get said build points and resources to the Soviet Union. A lot of the Axis strategy when they go into Russia can revolve around denying paths for Western aid to reach the Soviet Union, which will make the Soviet Union much easier to conquer. So there is an awful lot going on with production and how it actually impacts not just the size and shape of each major power's military forces, but also the strategies that you pursue in game. And you will find that you never have enough build points to do what you either want to do or need to do. So for me, the production system is one of the elements that makes World in Flames sort of stand out among many of its competitors in the grand strategic genre. I do, however, have to say I'm a little disappointed that they made the gearing limit rule an option rather than keeping it as part of the standard core rules like they had for decades. Because for me, the gearing limit is one of those rules that makes the WIF production system a little unique and, again, adds a lot to, I think, the experience of playing the game that you don't necessarily find in some of the other games out there. So with that, I think we'll wrap up today. I appreciate you watching. Stay tuned. We've got a few more episodes coming up to wrap up the core rules. We're going to take a look at Conquest and Vichy France, and then we'll start in on some of the optional rules. So thanks for watching today. Take care, and we'll see you next time.